She's a saint. That's what the church calls her. The first woman of Kievan Rus to accept baptism, the Holy Mother who brought light into a pagan land, drowning in blood. But legends remember her differently. In the ashes of Iskorostan, in the silence of 1,000 murdered warriors, in the whimpers of messengers buried alive, there is no halo, only fire. She didn't cry when they tore her husband apart. They tied his legs to 2 bent birch trees and let go. One half of his body flew east, the other west. His killers, the Drevlians, expected her to weep, to beg, to surrender the throne and become their pawn. But Olga did not grieve. She planned. They sent her suitors. She sent them coffins. The first delegation burned alive in their boat. The second, buried in a ditch by her own hands. The third, slaughtered at a feast after drinking her wine. Not poison, no. She wanted them to scream. She wanted them to know she was smiling. Then came the birds. She asked for peace. A token, she said. Just a few doves from every house in their capital city. At night, her soldiers tied sulfur and oil to their feet. When the birds returned home, the sky turned orange. Iskorostan burned without a single siege, just wings, fire, and her silence. They say she killed 7 kings. Some say it was only 1 tribe. Some say none of it happened. But every child in Rus grew up hearing her name, whispered like a prayer you're too afraid to finish, and every ruler after her ruled in her shadow. This is not a story of forgiveness, not of faith. This is the story of Olga of Kiev, regent, widow, mother, and the queen who turned revenge into legend. And it all began with a single scream deep in the forest, the moment her husband died. He was supposed to collect tribute. He ended up scattered in pieces. Igor of Kiev rode out with soldiers and arrogance. He had already demanded payment once. That should have been enough. But he came back again. Greedy, impatient, pushing too far. The Drevlians had smiled the first time. The second time, they showed their teeth. They tied his legs to 2 birch saplings, bent low with ropes. And when they cut the ropes, the trees sprang upright, ripping him apart at the waist. Half a prince went east. Half went west. It was not just murder, it was a message. Back in Kiev, the court waited. The silence was strange. There was no scout, no word, no riders in the mist. Then, days later, a single whisper reached the palace. The prince was dead. And not just dead, humiliated, butchered, left in the woods like a warning to others. They expected collapse. The Drevlians believed the state would break without its king. That chaos would follow. That the queen, young, alone, and draped in mourning, would surrender. But Olga did not mourn. She planned. She made no speech. She showed no sorrow. She held her son's hand and sat the throne, unmoved. To the outside world, she was calm. To the inside world, she was calculating. And the Drevlians, blind in their triumph, made their next mistake. They sent 20 men to Kiev, proposing marriage. One of their own would take Igor's place, they said. A new husband for the queen. A unification of peoples. They killed her husband, and then asked for her hand. Olga received the messengers with honor. She told them they would be carried into the city by boat, as guests of the crown. No walking, no mud, only dignity. So the men climbed into a long wooden boat. The people of Kiev stood watching in eerie silence. Then, at her signal, the boat was lifted, not onto the river, but into a trench, and they buried it, alive. The earth swallowed them whole, and the crowd said nothing. No panic, no riot, only dirt falling. That was the first delegation. The Drevlians were still waiting for an answer, and she would send one soon, sweetened, of course, with promises and smoke. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. She just asked them to wait. The second Drevlian delegation arrived days later, more important, more decorated, more confident. Not 20 this time. More. These weren't errand boys. They were nobles. The kind of men who thought blood gave them power and that charm could disguise insult. They brought fine clothes. They brought their best smiles. And they brought the belief that this queen was alone, that she had no army, no king, and most of all, no teeth. Olga greeted them at the gates, her face unreadable. She spoke softly, offered wine, and thanked them for their presence. "You have come from far," she said. "You must be weary. Let us offer you rest before the ceremonies." She led them to a bathhouse, one built just for them. Fresh cedar, warm water, linen robes folded in corners. It smelled like pine sap and safety. They undressed. They laughed. They poured water over their shoulders and stretched their limbs. And just as the steam began to rise, the doors slammed shut. They weren't locked with chains. They were sealed with fire. From outside, her men stacked dry wood. Then they lit it. The bathhouse turned orange. The laughter stopped. The wood cracked. The walls hissed. No one inside made it out. And Olga? She didn't watch. She didn't need to. She already knew how quickly cedar burns. That night, the smoke curled through Kiev like incense, a funeral without mourning, a sacrifice without prayer. But Olga wasn't finished. The next morning, she sent a letter. It was warm, graceful, and full of humility. She accepted the Drevlian proposal, she said. But a queen could not travel alone. It would not be proper. "Send your finest men," she requested. "Your elders, your wisest, your best." They believed her. They had no idea that 2 delegations had already vanished. One beneath the earth, the other beneath the ash. And now they were preparing a third. They thought they were planning a royal wedding, but what Olga was preparing looked a lot more like a feast. They came dressed for a wedding. They left with their throats open. The Drevlians answered Olga's letter with pride. They gathered their elders, their wisest warriors, their most decorated nobles. These weren't emissaries. They were the soul of the tribe. The men who wrote laws, who led armies, who whispered into the ears of future kings. And they believed, truly believed, they were walking into a royal union. That a queen, humbled by grief, had chosen them for peace. She received them with perfect warmth. No weapons, no threats, only a banquet. In the great hall of Kiev, she ordered tables laid with fruit, roasted meats, rare honey, spiced wine. Her voice was soft, her eyes gentle. No mourning veil, no crown either. Just silk, firelight, and 1,000 unspoken things behind her smile. They drank, She toasted them. "To unity," she said, raising her goblet. And they laughed, unaware that the walls of the hall had been lined with soldiers waiting behind the tapestries. There was no signal, no shout, just a shift, too small to notice. A cup set down, a footstep out of place, then blades. One after another, the Drevlians fell where they sat. Some tried to rise, some reached for knives. Some never even registered the betrayal until the warmth in their stomach wasn't wine anymore. The queen stood still. Not a drop of blood touched her. She did not look away. She watched the whole thing, like someone watching grain fall from a sickle. It wasn't a feast. It was an execution dressed in velvet, and by the time the hall fell silent, there was no one left to speak for the Drevlians. No one except their people back home. Still unaware, still believing that a marriage was being arranged, that a queen was preparing to join them, not bury them. But Olga was not done writing her reply. She now turned her eyes to the Drevlian capital itself, not just its men, but its walls, its children, its very soil. And what came next would turn a city into smoke. She asked for birds, and the city gave her its lungs. Iskorosten, the Drevlian capital, had heard nothing of the deaths. No word from the first messengers. No smoke from the bathhouse. No whispers from the banquet. And so when Olga arrived at their gates with soldiers but no siege towers, they were confused, but not afraid. She spoke gently. No anger, no mention of blood. Just one request, peace. She told them the war was over before it began, that she had accepted their apology, mourned her husband, and now sought harmony. "I ask only for a small gesture," she said, "as a token of goodwill. Give me 3 birds from each house, doves, sparrows, whatever you keep in your homes, nothing more." They agreed. Why wouldn't they? It was Olga, the queen who forgave, the mother of Rus. So the townspeople gathered birds from rooftops and courtyards, cages and attics, handing them to her soldiers without suspicion. That night, every bird flew home with fire tied to its leg. Olga had ordered her men to attach sulfur and cloth to the birds' feet, set alight just before release. The moment they reached their nests, under wooden eaves and thatched rooftops, the city caught fire from within. No wall could stop it. No soldier could defend against it. The flames didn't march. They fluttered, flapped, and landed quietly before exploding upward. There was no siege, no battering ram, only feathers and fire. The people screamed into the smoke. Mothers ran carrying children wrapped in flames. Horses bolted through alleyways. Roofs collapsed in silence and then in ash. The city that had laughed behind its gates just hours earlier was now choking, crumbling, burning from the inside out. Olga watched from a hill. She did not speak. She did not look away. When the survivors crawled from the rubble, begging for mercy, she descended like a queen of embers. Some she enslaved, some she slaughtered. A few she spared, just enough to remember. And just like that, Iskorosten was gone. Not conquered, not occupied, erased. But fire was not the end of her story, because after the blood dried, she still had a throne to protect, and a son to raise in the shadow of everything she'd burned. She didn't build a tomb. She built a throne from the ashes. By the time the last Drevlian village was pacified, Olga no longer needed soldiers. Her name alone was enough. She had become more than a ruler. She was a warning. Cities that once scoffed now sent her tribute before she asked. Tribes that once mocked her marriage sent no proposals, only silence. But Olga didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She turned inward. Because there was one task left that no fire could finish. She had a son. Sviatoslav was still a boy, watching everything, absorbing it in silence like she once did after Igor's death. Olga did not raise him with lullabies or prayer. She raised him with memory. Not stories of vengeance, but the discipline that makes vengeance unnecessary. Every lesson she taught him had a weight to it. Every feast he saw her host, he knew who wasn't invited. And when he asked why the city of Iskorosten no longer existed, she simply told him, because some wounds are only healed when remembered. She didn't rule with affection. She ruled with precision. Court officials feared her composure more than any army. Foreign envoys left her presence feeling as if they had survived something they didn't understand. And Sviatoslav? He grew up watching a woman hold power without trembling. No lover, no advisor, just a mother and her country. But Olga was not only shaping a son, she was shaping succession. She restructured the tribute system to prevent another uprising like the one that killed Igor. She centralized authority, appointed regional governors loyal only to her, and slowly transformed Kiev into a seat of cold efficiency. Her vengeance had burned villages, but her governance burned the idea that Rus could survive without her hand at its throat. Years passed. Sviatoslav matured into the warrior she wanted him to be. Cold, brilliant, merciless on campaign. But even as he learned to fight, Olga began to seek something that swords could not bring her. Not blood, not fear, but baptism. And what came next would confuse even her enemies, because the woman who buried men alive and set cities on fire was now whispering prayers at night. She had burned villages to the ground. Now she wanted to be washed clean. Somewhere in the quiet that followed the blood, Olga began to shift. Not visibly, not suddenly, but in gestures too subtle for her enemies to notice. She met with priests, she read texts. She sat alone in the stillness of stone churches long before her people believed in such gods. For a woman who had ruled by fear, it wasn't a conversion. It was a calculation. She sought baptism not for salvation, but for survival. The world around her was changing. The Franks to the west were Christian. Byzantium to the south was Christian. Even trade routes now preferred crosses over pagan idols. And Olga, ever the strategist, knew that Rus could not remain a wolf among sheep forever. So she made the first move. Quiet, deliberate, veiled as personal faith, but rooted in political instinct. She traveled to Constantinople as ruler of a pagan land and returned as the first Christian royal of her people. But no triumphal procession followed. Her own son mocked the choice. Sviatoslav, raised in iron and conquest, told her openly, "I do not understand why you would kneel before a foreign god." She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply answered, "You will not understand now, but your children will." Because Olga wasn't just converting. She was planting a fuse beneath the future. Her baptism alienated her from the old guard of Rus. Pagan priests whispered about betrayal. Warriors grew uneasy. But she didn't flinch. She continued to rule with the same cold hands, now just dipped in holy water. Her court became bilingual in icons and iron. Her palace, half sanctuary, half fortress. And for all her quiet, there was one thing she never did. She never forced her people to follow. She didn't burn pagan idols or command mass baptisms. She knew better than to demand faith from fear. Instead, she let the fire smolder inside the walls, waiting. Years later, her grandson Vladimir would ignite that flame, converting the entire realm with sword and scripture. But the spark was hers. And while the church would one day call her saint, her past refused to die quietly, because the woman who whispered hymns had once buried men alive, and the church, too, would have to choose what to remember and what to canonize. They gave her a halo, but couldn't wash the blood off her hands. Centuries after her death, the church would elevate Olga of Kiev as a saint, the first Christian woman of Rus, a bringer of light, a vessel of divine mercy. Her icon would show her robed in gold, eyes lifted toward heaven, fingers curled around a cross. But nowhere in those images would you find the fire. Nowhere would you see the men buried alive, the bathhouse in flames, the birds carrying sparks into children's windows. She became a saint, not because they forgot what she did, but because they couldn't deny what she changed. Faith didn't begin in Rus with Vladimir. It began with her. And the church, caught between reverence and fear, had to make a choice. Either accept her and live with the contradiction, or reject the only royal who had dared to kneel before their altar while her kingdom still howled for war. So they canonized her. But they never explained her. No sermons mentioned the trenches. No hymns sang of Iskorosten. And yet, the people remembered, not in scripture, but in whispers, in campfire stories, in the quiet pause when someone spoke her name. Because Olga's sainthood was never clean. It was sharp. It cut both ways. To believers, she was the flame that lit the cross. To skeptics, she was the dagger wrapped in silk. To her own descendants, she was a mirror, revealing what power looks like when dressed as a woman with no one left to fear. And even in death, she ruled. Her remains were placed with honor, but her presence lingered elsewhere. In the way kings negotiated, in the way cities built their walls higher, in the way rulers learned to smile while plotting burial pits. So when the church wrote her name into their liturgy, they didn't erase her past. They just gave it new robes. And even now, centuries later, we still argue, did she rise to heaven with saints? Or did she drag the saints down to her level? But what history agrees on, what no priest, poet, or king has ever denied, is this: her legacy didn't fade. It spread like fire. She didn't vanish. She sank into the bones of the nation. Olga of Kiev did not die surrounded by enemies. She died respected, quiet, old, in her bed, not hunted, not overthrown, not dragged through streets like so many other rulers who had ruled through fear. And that, somehow, was the most terrifying part. She had outlived everyone who had doubted her, outlived every Drevlian survivor, every court whisper, every man who thought her power was temporary. She died a queen, a mother, a saint, and a shadow. Sviatoslav, now grown into a warlord with iron in his voice, refused to convert. His campaigns burned across the steppe like wildfire, yet even in his fury, he never touched the foundation his mother built. He didn't love her god, but he feared her legacy. The people of Kiev buried Olga in Christian rites. They sang. They prayed. They praised her as a holy mother of the realm. But outside the church, the old women still crossed themselves when they spoke her name. Not in reverence, in caution, because even in death, she was not entirely theirs. Her story split in two, like the body of her husband. In the east, she was Saint Olga, equal to the apostles. In the streets, she was Olga the burner, Olga the widow, who buried her enemies alive. And in between those versions, the truth lived in silence. She left behind no memoirs, no final confession, no softening of her deeds. She never apologized, never wept in public, never begged history to forgive her. She simply ruled, then left, and let the centuries argue. But what she built outlived her body, and what she destroyed never rose again. Even now in Kiev's oldest stones, there are places they say she walked. No statue, no plaque, just steps that echo a little louder than they should. And every time a ruler is praised for mercy or damned for vengeance, her name returns, not as an answer, but as a question. She was called a saint. But saints don't bury men alive. Saints don't burn cities with birds. Saints don't smile while the world screams. And yet, Olga of Kiev did all that. So maybe she wasn't a saint in the way we like to imagine. Maybe she was something older, colder. Something that reminds us that in the medieval world, mercy was a myth, and power belonged to the one who could wear a crown and carry a grudge without flinching. Thanks for walking through the fire with me today. If this story struck something in you, drop a comment. I want to know what you think. Was she a monster, or just a mirror of the age she ruled? Hit like, share this tale with a fellow history addict, and don't forget to subscribe. Your one click helps this dark archive grow more than you think. And if you want to keep digging into the blood-soaked thrones of medieval power, check out the full playlist, Royal Blood and Tortures, The Dark Medieval Tales. I'll see you in the next nightmare.